A question that I and many other Zelda fans here on YouTube receive frequently is, which 3D Zelda game is your favorite, or flat out, which one is the best? This is a loaded question, seeing as nostalgia, personal gameplay preferences, outside opinions, and more come into play and play hard. Oftentimes, I find myself in a tizzy as I can think of a myriad of reasons for each 3D Zelda game being number one, even with my personal leanings and nostalgia that usually win out in the end. And you know what? I think that no matter how objective we attempt to be, there will always be a reason to consider a different 3D Zelda game as top dog. So let's discuss that, why each 3D Zelda game could merit being number one. Hey y'all, I'm the Geek Apprentice discussing the 3D Zelda games and all of their awesomeness, if that wasn't evident already. The classic Ocarina of Time, the character side quest champ Majora's Mask, the timeless Wind Waker, the Dark Twilight Princess, the story-driven Skyward Sword, and the amazing Breath of the Wild. When hearing the name of each of these games, something is evoked in you, right? Nostalgia, a piece of music you can't get out of your head, a character you adore, a story that moved you. The list goes on. While there are, of course, a plethora of 2D Zelda games released throughout the years, it's crazy to think that since the late 90s, those are the only 3D Zelda games we have. But you know what? The developers took their time to make sure each title was spectacular, so that's fine by me. And as I mentioned earlier, though of course I have my own personal preferences and leanings, I could still argue for any of them to be number one, frankly, and that's exactly what I'm going to do in this video. No order dictated by ranking, but simply listing them out by order of release date and explaining why each is awesome and deserves the number one spot on someone's list. To help guide things, I will be discussing 5 key elements: graphics, gameplay, dungeons, story and characters, and, shocker of shockers, music. The classic, the renowned, the one that is still held as a standard to live by for 3D Zelda games to this day, Ocarina of Time. Obviously, being born in '95, I wasn't aware of how big a transition this game was for the series, but it was my first Zelda game, so I have massive nostalgic ties to it. Okay, I understand that the graphics of this game are starting to get dated and that nostalgic leanings are what would sway me. But I also understand that this was the N64, the late 90s, and the first time Zelda had been in 3D. So all around, great job. All things considered, these graphics are great in my opinion. There's something about them that even though it's been well over 20 years, it's not jarring to look at. You implicitly understand upon seeing the game that yes, it's old, but it does what it needs to and does it well. Ocarina of Time offered some great new stuff in terms of gameplay. Praise the Lord the developers decided against first person. Bet you didn't know that was a thing. Riding on a horse was freaking awesome. Z-targeting saves my poor game-playing butt time and time again. So many different pieces of equipment, magic, and more. And let's be honest, even if this is not your favorite of the 3D titles, it's still so much fun to play even today. Other than not being able to equip your boots, which to me is not a reason to play the unworthy of any praise 3DS version, there's not much to gripe about. It's fun to play. There you go. Dungeons were not a new thing to Zelda by any means, but Ocarina of Time, I think, flawlessly brought them to the world of 3D gaming. Between the themes, puzzles, music, and story behind each one, I don't think I need to drone on for long. Each dungeon is incredibly unique and has something for everyone, from the Deku Tree, to the Water Temple, to the Shadow Temple, to Ganon's Castle. They're unforgettable, and I think this is the only title in the series where I can easily name each one without thinking. The chatty companion of Navi, the incredible villain of Ganondorf, the significance but diversity of each sage, the quirkiness of all those side characters located from Kokiri Forest to Lon Lon Ranch to the market, to Kakariko Village. All a part of this delightful but dark story of a boy thrust into the midst of saving Hyrule only to make one mistake that robs him of his childhood and scorches the very land he was trying to save. Ocarina of Time has a stellar story and set of characters. Without a doubt, the developers went all out for their first 3D Zelda. And this is considering too that story is never the highest priority when creating a game. Oh, I could gush about the perfection of the music in Ocarina of Time. Each dungeon is absolutely incredible, from the disturbance of the Forest Temple to the grandness of the Spirit Temple. The themes you get to play on your ocarina were so well composed, not only to be pleasing to listen to, but also to actually get to play, from Bolero of Fire to the classic Zelda's Lullaby. And all the rest, whether pulled from old games like Kakariko Village or brand new like Gerudo Valley, too memorable to be anything but the best. Overall, Ocarina of Time is a classic that to me cannot be matched. It's got the lore that leaves you with chills, music you'll never forget, dungeons that inspire for ages to come, and nostalgia that keeps it relevant and too good to ever be below top 3 for any list of mine. The game with arguably the best and most satisfying side quests. The one with such dark twists and turns that it's often considered darker than the 3D title that was inspired by darkness. The one that could have been remembered only as a cheap sequel, but instead is a favorite for countless gamers, Majora's Mask. Having the same engine and thus the same graphics as Ocarina of Time, there's not much to point out except to say how smoothly and well the developers managed to use it again without making the game feel redundant. Right from the get-go, there are some changes that stand out, like flipping when Link jumps instead of just a skip from one spot to the next. But on top of all that it inherited from Ocarina of Time, we have the amazing mechanic of masks. If you've done deep dives into Zelda history, then you know one of the things that inspired the creators to make Majora's Mask in the first place was the thought that masks in Ocarina of Time were underused. How did they know they could even make a game around that? I'm sure some were skeptical, but then happily blown away by the result, as were we. Due to the time crunch, Majora's Mask wasn't going to be a dungeon-heavy game. Rightly so, the developers put the gameplay focus on side quests, but left the dungeon amount to 4 so as to keep the game short and allow them to put their efforts into making a few great dungeons rather than a bunch of boring ones. And what was delivered were 4 quite unique dungeons. Our forest dungeon was a swamp dungeon that even gave lore for Deku Scrubs. Our water dungeon, rather than the typical Zora's Domain, was mechanical and disturbing. Instead of fire for Gorons, we got a snow dungeon for Gorons. And our creepy ethereal dungeon was met with the crazy mechanic of flipping the dungeon upside down. And of course the creepy statues from the Elegy of Emptiness. One of the most talked about qualities of Majora's Mask is its side quests, and for good reason. They aren't just a ton of fetch quests to fill the game that only has 4 dungeons. Rather, most of them contain some powerful, even if simple, stories that stick with gamers. It's actually quite impressive how the developers could take the exact character models of several characters from Ocarina of Time and transform them in a way where we genuinely believe that it's a new character. While Majora's Mask may not be known for a big, massive, overarching story, it is well known for its impactful little ones and great characters that you really feel for. And I think part of what makes Majora's Mask even more depressing of a story is the fact that Link is just this little boy who's gone through so much and then sent back in time to relive his childhood from Ocarina of Time, and was just in search of an old friend, presumably Navi. But here he was thrust into the middle of this chaos of the moon falling on this town and all of the people within it having their own issues that he helps to solve. It's honorable, but quite dark. Right from the start of the game, when you boot it up and you hear that creepy Skull Kid laugh, when you hear that dark tribal-esque music, you know you're in for something different. Koji Kondo brought all the creepy here, from scary themes like when the aliens invade Romani Ranch, to existentially disturbing themes like the Final Hour theme. Each dungeon, of course, was matched with its own fitting themes. The haunting nature of the Woodfall Temple, the mechanically weird theme for Great Bay Temple, the painful sounds of Snowhead Temple, and the twisted vibes of Stone Tower Temple. Not to mention great area themes like the Deku Palace, Great Bay itself, and Clock Town. Oh, and did I mention there are more great themes for our ocarina like the Bremen March? So good. As mentioned before, Majora's Mask could have easily become just the sequel to Ocarina of Time with nothing memorable. However, I believe that sometimes it even overshadows Ocarina of Time. We often say it's so good for a game made in a year, but frankly, it's just an incredible game in general, time crunch aside. A game that brought a lot of polarization at its release. A game that easily dispelled such concerns and rose to be a fan favorite. A game known for some of the most stellar music and adventurous vibes, The Wind Waker. There is no denying just how fantastically the graphics of this game have aged. Obviously, I do prefer the HD version for several reasons, but even the original is not jarring to look at 20 years later. The irony is the graphics were the main source of controversy at its release, with many claiming it was too childish. If you play through the entire game, you know it gets dark. But the choice of cell shading was nothing to sniff at. Easily one of my favorite Zelda games just to watch because of how good it looks. As much as I adore playing Ocarina of Time, knowing it's good and nostalgia plays a part, Wind Waker, honestly, is even more fun. Sure, nostalgia will play a small part here too, I was 7 years old after all, but to me, it is genuinely such fun gameplay. Between the new techniques with sword fighting, hiding in a barrel, and stealing enemy weapons, Wind Waker was a nice step up. I won't lie though, I'm definitely glad the HD version downsized the Triforce fetch quest. While Wind Waker may not have had the most memorable dungeons for me personally, I do enjoy them for what they are. I particularly loved the wind aspect of both the Wind Temple and the Forbidden Woods. My favorite, however, is the Tower of the Gods, if only for the music. Overall, Wind Waker provided some fun new gameplay for the dungeons, like involving Makar and Medley in 2 of the dungeons, and visiting the Forsaken Fortress twice. So even if I may not remember them too well, I do remember that they are well done and enjoyable to play. What a beautiful story and cute characters, am I right? I mean, the reason for Link's journey is so simple. Love for his little sister. Link in the Wind Waker is a simple boy who lives with his sweet grandma and silly little sister. His sister gets terrifyingly kidnapped, and to Link, the choice is obvious. Fight to get her back. And then you throw in all the great characters. Tetra/Pirate Zelda and her crew, Orca the sword trainer, Salvatore with his battleship minigame, Medley, Makar, and Ganondorf. Oh my gosh, I love the story they gave him in this game. He seems almost sympathetic in this game, which was so well done. And his death? Hot dang. Even though not one of these dungeon themes made it as #1 in my music series, Wind Waker has so many stellar happy pieces. Outset Island, Windfall Island, Dragon Roost Island, a crowd favorite, Forest Haven. The game is just chock full of wonderful themes that are beyond easy and delightful to listen to. Beyond that, even every sound is just so good. Whether it's picking up an item, the enemy sounds, or even dropping something, the little sounds were accounted for in that they weren't just the usual Zelda sounds, but updated to work for this specific game. Wind Waker is a warhorse when it comes to music and sounds.
The Wind Waker is a timeless classic if only for its graphics, though I do believe there's a lot within it that has aged well. I don't know. It just never ceases to make me smile ear to ear. It's fun to look at, wonderful to listen to, and exciting to play time and time again, HD or not. A game born out of the rejection of its predecessor. A game whose first trailer set off a wildfire of excitement like never before. A game renowned for having one of, if not the best side character of any Zelda game to date, Twilight Princess. When gamers, particularly in the US, complained about the quote-unquote kiddie nature of Wind Waker's graphics, even though I think those people are insane, Nintendo listened and came back strong for Twilight Princess. Even though the graphics of this game, HD or not, certainly have not stood the test of time like Wind Waker has, that's realistic graphics for you, I personally still like them. Yes, I love cel shading, but I enjoy this look as well. Was it a little too dark, literally speaking? Perhaps, but again, I love it, and I think it's simply because of how well it fits the atmosphere and vibe of this specific title. First of all, combat on a horse. That alone puts the gameplay set to awesome. But then you have all of those wolf mechanics. These Zelda developers are crazy, but I love it. Easily the weirdest music mechanic with that in mind, but still fun to play. And then you have Spidey Link because of the double hookshot. You know, I think I forgot just how fun and creative the gameplay for Twilight Princess was. Definitely looking forward to playing the HD version after I finish Skyward Sword HD. Okay, there are a lot of dungeons in Twilight Princess. Zelda history buffs know that it's common speculation that the reason for this is because some were unused ideas for their Wind Waker. Fine by me. While I probably would not be able to name each one without looking them up, what I do remember is unique styles. For example, you have the Goron Mines, which boast great music, and the super cool magnet mechanic. The Arbiter's Ground has its quicksand and scary lore. Temple of Time has its callback to Ocarina of Time. City in the Sky has Spidey Link and the inspiration of that weird painting. Palace of Twilight has the hand-chasing thing which scares the living daylight out of me every single time. And then there's Snow Peak Ruins with Yeto and Yetta. Enough said. I think Twilight Princess boasts one of my favorite Zelda stories to date. I'm sure most of us assumed at the start that Zelda was the Twilight Princess, and the imp would just be another companion, but we were all happily wrong. That imp is Midna, and she's hailed as the best companion character in all of Zelda, and I will happily agree to that. She's not just a side character, she is the Twilight Princess and has such a wonderful arc and part to play in this title. Then you've got Zant the Usurper King, the children of Ordon and the wonderful story arc of Little Colin. Oh, and Ganondorf again, not as sympathetic as Wind Waker, but I love the menacing route they took for this part of the timeline. I'm quite sad Koji Kondo couldn't get his way with this one in having a live orchestra, but the music developers for this title still did an amazing job. If the title screen alone is anything to go by, you know you're in for a treat. Snow Peak, City in the Sky, Goron Mines, Hyrule Field Day or Night, Ilia's Theme, Midna's Lament, The Herd Game, even Malomart, all such well done pieces that leave an impact. I'm even especially quite fond of how Epona's theme sounds on that weird leaf whistle thing. Twilight Princess will always hold a special place, as it was watching a Let's Play of this game which got me back into Zelda after years of absence. Great music, great characters and plot twists, enough quirkiness to keep it really Zelda even amidst the dark themes, and super fun gameplay. No wonder it's a favorite for so many. The game that polarized the Zelda community, the game with the greatest story of the series, the game that ended up being considered an underrated gem despite the flaws, Skyward Sword. Probably the coolest thing about the graphics of this game, even if they're not my favorite even in HD, is the fact that they were inspired by watercolor painting. How cool is that? The only reason I mention it not being my favorite is because I don't care for how the human characters look in that style. However, the entirety of the game looks amazing in this way. So bright and colorful, yet even the grittier areas have a boost from being in this art style. While I personally cannot speak to the motion controls being left-handed and just unable to grasp it for some reason, I've actually heard a lot in favor of this mechanic. Most would argue that as long as you're willing to take the time to learn it and move around, it's super fun. That sounds accurate to me. What I find fascinating is how the gameplay in its entirety was designed around this concept. Love it or hate it, that's such a Nintendo thing to do. So bold and so brilliant to me. Yet, they also managed to make the motion controls better and make button controls work, and praise the Lord for that, as now I've been able to play. And though I do not know much of the original, I can tell they made some great changes in the HD version to help streamline the gameplay, and for me, it's been a ton of fun. Skyward Sword certainly boasts its own great and unique dungeons, some crowd favorites being the Ancient Cistern, the Earth Temple, and the Sand Ship. For me personally, the only one that felt kind of slow was the Lanayru mining facility, but even then I have enjoyed each dungeon thus far, and I'm looking forward to Skykeep. Dungeons in Skyward Sword don't get talked about too often, either because people didn't want to deal with the motion controls, or they felt they were too easy. I'm not good with difficult dungeons, mostly they're bosses, so these were nice and refreshing for me. Oh my goodness, the story of Skyward Sword is absolutely captivating and beautiful. The characters are so rich. The love story between Link and Zelda we've always wanted but never worked previously. The terrifying and disturbing narcissistic nature of Girahim. The twist of Impa and the Old Lady. And the fantastic arc of the one and only Groose. All bundled together to tell the amazing beginnings of the lore of Zelda. The history of how Hyrule, the Master Sword, the Hylian Shield, and even the Crest came to be. With the introduction of Fi, and thank the Lord for her toning down in the HD version, the concept of the Master Sword only responding to the hero makes so much more sense now. I always wondered how the sword just knows, you know? But with the inclusion of Fi, even something as simple as the Master Sword has stronger lore behind it. Finally, a live orchestra for a Zelda game, and what a good choice too! The Ballad of the Goddesses, Skyloft, pretty much every dungeon theme, and more. Such incredible themes enhanced by the fullness of being recorded with a live orchestra. While it is sad that our only playing, quote-unquote, of an instrument wasn't super fun in this game, the music itself made up for that. Koji Kondo never ceases to impress. While I understand why many have their doubts about this game because they couldn't get into the motion controls or for some other reason, I do think it's deserving of more praise than it is given. Yes, I understand I can only give so much of my opinion seeing as I've never used the motion controls except for trying it out and it didn't work, but at the very least, in the HD version, it was done total justice and I have loved every second of playing it. Okay, almost every second. I get frustrated easily, but nonetheless, Skyward Sword is a wonderful game. The game inspired by the one that started it all. The game which took some of the best of previous Zelda games and even games outside of Nintendo. The game that left us all shook as it flipped the Zelda formula on its head and rocked our gaming world, Breath of the Wild.
The history of the royal family of Hyrule is also the history of the Calamity Ganon, a primal evil that has endured over the ages.
Cell shading makes a glorious comeback in this installment and I adore it. The amount of times I would goof off to do nothing but admire the scenery of the game was staggering. I mean, it's just so beautiful. And we've been given such a variety in landscaping too. Desert, volcano, swamp, tundra, fields, mountains, winter, spring, autumn, summer, lakes, rain, sunshine, snow, heat waves. Breath of the Wild has got it all. Going back to the series' roots of an open world, taking from other games with open worlds, while also keeping the game so clearly Zelda, that takes skill, Nintendo. All the weapons, the freedom to do pretty much anything in any order. It's so simple to say out loud, but Breath of the Wild was honestly the most fun I've ever had just playing a Zelda game. And I'm someone who enjoys a fair amount of linearity, so that is really saying something for me. Yes, I know Breath of the Wild didn't have the dungeons we are used to, and I really hope they return in the sequel, but I enjoyed what we had. The shrines were fun for me because I wasn't overwhelmed by having to finish the entire dungeon in one sit down. I don't like having to return to dungeons when I'm halfway through. I either get it done or I don't. I also actually liked the Divine Beasts. They were great for lore and story, especially when you understand the beeps in the beginning of each theme. Were they easy except for Thunderblight Ganon? Sure. But I still found the quote-unquote dungeons of this game quite fun and a nice change. While it was weird to collect the story out of order and even have it all take place in the past, I thought the story of Breath of the Wild was phenomenal. Considering the barren nature of the world you're in when you wake up, it makes sense that, like with the music I'll discuss in a moment, the story was bare bones too. What we were given did its job well. I loved focusing on Zelda and her journey, and definitely found myself holding back some tears every now and again. And thus, I'm looking forward to seeing how the developers flesh it out into a bigger story in the sequel. Against popular opinion, I stand by the genius of the music in Breath of the Wild. I even have a video dedicated to it, which I did with Captburgerson. Of course I adore the big bombastic themes the series is known for, but such a thing would not have fit the atmosphere of this title. The music designers did so much justice when it comes to the music of this game, both reused and new themes. So gentle and subtle at times that, much like with the scenery, I'd find myself plugging in some earbuds and just allowing myself to listen to the beauty of the score. So artfully done. A compilation of this game's music is often my go-to for relaxing. Then you have the beeps of the beginning of each Divine Beast theme, which I believe it was a user on Reddit or something pointed out was Morse code for SOS. That's heartbreaking. That's also great detail. And finally, outside and inside Hyrule Castle. Wow! If you truly waited to go near the castle till you felt prepared, that music was well deserved and earned. Overall, Breath of the Wild has some of my favorite music. Risky choices that made for excellent pieces. Breath of the Wild overall took a lot of risks, and in my opinion, they paid off. It was the first 3D title that I played without any outside influence. All the Zelda games I played prior, I had watched either my brothers or someone on YouTube play parts first. But Breath of the Wild was a wonderful experience for me and is easily in my top 3 favorite Zelda games. Wow. What a great series of games. I mean, what more can I say? I'm sure there are several topics I could have covered as well, such as bosses, mini-bosses, side quests, enemies, and more, but I digress. Whether your love of Zelda began back in the 80s, your first was the latest installment, or somewhere in between, there is something for everyone.